Thank you very much. I'd like to thank LiveCorp and all the conference organisers for inviting me to speak today. I'm not a very polished public speaker, and I feel like a little bit like a rabbit in the spotlights up here at the moment. But bear with me. So, right, just by way of introduction, so I'm President of the Australian Cattle Veterinarians. I represent about 1,100 vets Australia-wide, and these are all vets that are integrally involved with the livestock industry in Australia. So what's this all about? This is my wife. This was my wife's idea. She thought that everybody should stand up, turn to the person next to them, ask them to bend over and stick your left hand in, shake it all about and pull it out again. But that's not really what it's all about. We're talking about animal welfare in the livestock, in the live export industry, okay? And the role that pregnancy diagnosis has in that. I appreciate that's only a very small cog in a very big wheel in the live export sector, but it is nonetheless pretty important. At the end of the day, the live export supply chain is an unsuitable environment, and it'll lead to poor outcomes for neonatal calves. There's no doubt about that. So regardless of whether it's in the export depot that cows are calving, small numbers of cattle calving on ships, or whether that's in destination markets. That's partly because of the very intensive environment that these calves may be born into, but also because none of these facilities are set up for calves. They're set up for handling feeder cattle. And clearly a calf 2 days old on the ground in that kind of environment is not a feeder animal. It also, there's also risk to the cow as well with abortion, dystocia and metritis and so forth in those sort of environments. So how do we quantify this problem? Over the many years that I've been involved in the cattle industry in Australia, there's been, fairly common and frequent reports, anecdotal reports of problems with pregnancy, misdiagnosis of pregnancy in the supply chain, right from the depots through to destination markets. And I've certainly been in a number of destination markets where calves have turned up when these animals clearly should have been empty. Nonetheless, investigations are very rare. There's only been a very small number, 2 that I'm aware of in the last 5 or so years, where there's been investigation into why cattle that are meant to be not pregnant have been diagnosed pregnant in destination markets. And the reality is that we just don't have the data. So in depots and registered premises, there's no requirement to record calvings or misdiagnosed pregnancies in those environments. Shipboard, for many decades, AAVs and stockmen have been going on ships and recording the number of calvings and abortions. That's a statutory requirement in our daily and end of voyage reports. But none of that data is retrievable. I can't retrieve that data for the last 12 months, let alone the last 20 years. So we look at ASCAS. Again, the data is not really collected. There is some provision within ASCAS to identify how many female animals are leaving the ASCAS system and going into the breeder system, and we would assume that a pretty reasonable proportion of those are pregnant or calved, but we really don't know because there's no actual requirement within ASCAS to report calvings. Okay, so that data is not available. And believe it or not, we don't even know how many female cattle we export out of Australia. I've been trying to find this out for 6 months. Does anybody in the room know how many female cattle we exported out of Australia in the last 12 months? Anyone want to have a crack at it? Is it 60% of total exports? 55, 50, 45? We don't really know. The data's collected. Right, it's every single shipment is classified by class and sex. That's all fed into the department, but we can't get that data back out again. And so the other issue we have here is that in terms of quantifying the problem, we know there's a spectrum of skills and accuracy of pregnancy diagnosis across the industry. We've got a number of different service providers in the territory. In WA, we have accredited testers. Any vet who's registered can preg-test cattle anywhere in Australia for export. And then we have precheck accredited vets, which is our accreditation system in our organisation. So I just want to bust a few myths for a start. First one, you don't need a vet degree to pregnancy test. I mean, clearly that's not a myth. Clearly that's quite true. There's probably a number of people in this room that would rate themselves pretty competent at preg testing, and no doubt many of those are. But we really don't know because there's this spectrum of skills from fairly basic right through to what we would consider to be competency. Just as you don't need to have a vet degree to pregnancy test, you know, I'm pretty good at spaying cats and dogs. Doesn't make me a brain surgeon, you know, like there's a difference between having basic skills and having competency. Another myth is I think industry has accepted far too low standards when it comes to diagnosis accuracy of pregnancy testing. You know, most people would say that 100% accuracy is not achievable, and I suspect most people that have dealt with preg-tested cattle in this room would think of examples where that's certainly not been the case. Okay, but competency, in our view, equals 100% accuracy, and you know, human error does occur, but we expect that 99.9% or greater is a reasonable goal to have. It's not, you know, we shouldn't settle for second best. Another myth, we believe it's a myth or a misconception, is that vets are not accessible in Australia to do this work, or they're too expensive. In Australia, we have 470 currently accredited vets all around Australia, precheck accredited vets. We believe we are cost competitive with non-veterinary contractors. That's probably, you know, that's probably a contentious issue in the audience. Our position, the ACV's position, is if these cattle, these export feeder cattle, are preg tested by a precheck accredited vet, we've lobbied for more than 10 years that the pre-export period should be pushed from 30 days out to 45 days without any additional risk, and I'll explain why in a little while, to make accessibility and logistic management of feeder cattle a lot easier. We haven't had a lot of support from industry on that idea. So we'll just look at technique versus technology. We know there's ultrasounds out there. We know there's blood tests available these days to preg test as well. So why the hell are we still sticking our hands up cows' bums? The reason is it's still the most accurate way to determine if a cow is not pregnant, okay? And the reason that is because when I palpate a cow for pregnancy or non-pregnancy, I'm palpating the entire reproductive tract of that animal, okay? And I'm making sure there's not a pregnancy in it. And we believe with a competent person that you can achieve 100% accuracy in diagnosing all cattle that are 6 or more weeks pregnant. So we should be able to identify with 100% accuracy pregnancy, and that by default that means that those that are under 6 weeks pregnant are not what we call not detectably pregnant. So let's look at ultrasounds. Ultrasounds are great for detecting pregnancies because what an ultrasound does is it sends a sound wave down into the cow's abdomen, and it bounces back when sound hits something solid and bounces it off it. It travels through fluid and it bounces off solid stuff. So what's a calf? Calf's a solid thing floating around in a bag of fluid. It's that simple. So we see this black image with white things floating around inside it. We can either identify the cotyledons, the placental attachments on the uterus, or we can identify the calf itself. So it's great for detecting pregnancy, except some pregnancies are much more difficult to find with an ultrasound. The reason is that the pregnancy is just deep in the cow's abdomen and you can't reach it with a probe. It's much more difficult with an ultrasound to examine the entire empty reproductive tract. We've got Matt Izzo down here, he's asleep with his hat on, so he's asleep. Matt's a registered specialist in cattle medicine in Australia, and he's one of the best ultrasounders in Australia, and he's bloody good at this, right? But there are very few people that can, with an ultrasound alone, 100% diagnose not pregnant cattle by ultrasound, and it's simply because there's not much contrast between the reproductive tract and the rest of the abdominal contents. Okay, so it's not easy, and you certainly can't do it at 200 or 250 animals an hour. If someone's doing that, they're not doing pregnancy testing, they're doing rectal tourism. So it's not well suited for export feeder cattle. There's an EAN in 2016 that says that it should only be done by a veterinarian, okay? And I'd be surprised if there's not lay testers out there that are certifying cattle preg tested for export that are not using an ultrasound. But just briefly, we'll talk about blood testing a little bit. Blood testing for pregnancy is actually very accurate in cattle now. There's a really good test, okay? It's better than 99% accurate over a whole population of animals. The biggest problem with it and why it's not that applicable to export cattle is that there's about 4% of animals where it doesn't make a diagnosis. So those animals have to be retested or tested again by another method. And the problem with that is they've got to be remustered or redrafted to do that. So it's just not quite practical to use. So let's talk about technicians versus veterinarians. This is a fairly contentious issue as well in Australia. So in ACIL, there's what we call competent testers, and they're certified in the territory by the DPINF. That's not right. It's not called the DPINF anymore, is it? DPIR, is that right? Yeah. Sorry, that should have been fixed. So in the territory, there's 79 accredited competent testers. In WA, they're accredited by the Veterinary Surgeons Board, and there's only 4 of them. And the reason why that is because they have to be supervised by a veterinarian, and most veterinarians don't want to supervise a lay tester unless they're very sure that they have high levels of competency. And let's face it, that they're not competing for work themselves. In Queensland, there's the vet surgeons regulations have been under review for some time. AgForce is very keen on deregulating pregnancy testing in Queensland and making it more accessible for non-veterinarians to preg test in Queensland. That's still under review, and we don't really know the outcome of the decision there. CCA and MLA are exploring national accreditation options for pregnancy testing. So it's a muddy waters across Northern Australia. Now, there's no doubt, and I'm sure there's probably a few people in this room, some contractors and DIY testers are highly competent, very competent indeed. But the reality is the quality of testing is variable. And the biggest problem is that the training is minimal and the assessment standards are very poor. So I hope you can see this slide up here. We'll just compare what a competent tester that's recognised by the NT or the WA government has to go through to become a competent tester versus a precheck accredited veterinarian. So the training program, it's a nationally recognised training program. It's a 2-day course. To be a precheck accredited vet, usually you graduated 1 or 2 years, you've been mentored for a while by your boss, you've been taught on the road how to preg test accurately before you undergo examination. Experience and currency to do the competent tester course. While most people would have done a bit before they went and did that course, there's no prior experience required to do that. To maintain currency in the territory, you have to do 500 head a year, or a rolling average of that over 3 years. Precheck accredited vets, you can't undergo examination until you've logged at least 2,000 head, and you need to be doing a minimum of 1,000 head a year to maintain your accreditation. Let's look at the examination. For the competent testers course, the examination is typically held over 20 head. It's a yes/no diagnosis only. You don't have to fetally age what's there, and not detectably pregnant is crikey, I've lost my train of thought. I can't even think of the word. It's less than 8 weeks pregnant. So not detectably pregnant means less than 8 weeks pregnant, okay? The precheck accredited vet, the examination is done over at least 100 head. It's a yes/no diagnosis, plus you need to do fetal ageing, and the examiner, you have to agree within a fairly close range with the examiner on that. And not detectably pregnant, it's a difficult word, under our system means less than 6 weeks pregnant. So 2-week difference there, okay? So accreditation-wise, as I said, in the territory it's the DPINR, in WA it's the Veterinary Surgeons Board, not permitted at the moment in Queensland. For a precheck accredited vet, that's run by our association on a shoestring budget. We basically examine, we have a range of examiners that are very experienced, and they examine them out of goodwill pretty much. Yeah, so that's the scheme we run. In terms of accuracy, we don't really know, but competent testers, they're likely to be somewhere between 90 to 100% accurate. There'll be some really good ones and there'll be some pretty ordinary ones. We expect nothing less in our scheme than 100% accuracy. You know, there might be human error does occur, but that's our expectation. Accountability. There's not much accountability if you're a competent tester. Yes, in the territory they can take your accreditation away if there's an investigation and you're found pretty wanting. If you're an ordinary veterinarian, you're always subject to Veterinary Surgeons Board regulations in whatever state you're practicing in. So you are held to account for your competency. And I would encourage you, if you've got a vet who's no good and he's providing an incompetent service, the first thing you want to do is take that up with the local Veterinary Surgeons Board because it's a competency issue and we are held to account for it. If they're a precheck accredited vet, we have a system in place we have an investigation process in place and a dispute resolution process in place as well. I won't worry about insurance, but in terms of risk, from a competent tester through to a precheck vet, through that spectrum, you know, there's a range of skills from fairly basic to what we consider is competent, and they're quite different. So what does all this mean? At the end of the day, this is how it is. Manual palpation is the most suitable method for feeder cattle in Australia. Okay, yep. A really good operator can use an ultrasound, but a really bad operator will do, or a fairly ordinary operator will do a really bad job with an ultrasound. That's why it's not really the best method to do it. A precheck accredited vet, I hope I've explained this to you, is the gold standard. Okay, we are expecting 100% competency out of our members that are accredited. And other providers can be, like I said, there's a range, there's a spectrum there. They can be good. The vast majority probably are pretty good, from right through to indifferent and ordinary in some cases. And there's a difference between pregnancy diagnosis for certification for an export market and pregnancy diagnosis for livestock management. Okay, so cattle are coming into a feedlot. They need to process those cattle pretty quickly. They might have a tolerance for a certain level of pregnancy in those animals, and that might be okay for them. If you're on a station and you are preg testing, you might have a tolerance for a certain level of errors. But this is certification for a $1.2 billion a year industry, and there is a difference. So a veterinary certificate comes with a certain amount of credibility, accountability and liability that you're just not going to get with a competent tester's certificate. So what are our challenges and opportunities? This is my very crude attempt at low-hanging fruit. I've got a couple of calves hanging off the bottom of the tree here. At the end of the day, calvings and unmanaged pregnancies are preventable and unacceptable. I hope everybody in the room agrees that that is unacceptable in our export industry. We are held to a higher level of account than any other livestock industry in Australia. Like it or not, that's how it is. We've squandered, absolutely, as an industry, you know, I'm not pointing the finger at anybody, as an industry we have squandered the opportunity to utilise existing data. We've been collecting the data, but we can't extract it and look at it. Okay, we've got no idea whether it's a big problem or a small problem. This is what we call morbidity data. So in the live export industry for years we've had mortality data, we're used to that, but we're moving towards animal welfare indicators and morbidity data as measures of animal welfare outcomes. So this is what we're talking about. Pregnancy diagnosis and misdiagnosed pregnancies in our livestock live export industry. That's what morbidity data is. And it's no good unless you do something with it. You know, you can't manage it if you can't measure it. So we don't have the data systems in place at the moment, or any of the epidemiological analysis systems in place to do much with it at the moment. The challenge I would like to just lay on the table here for all you guys out in industry is, I can tell you how good we are and how bad lay preg testers are. That's not really what this is about. What I want to know is, what is industry's tolerable limit? I can tell, if you tell me what it is, I can tell you how to get there. But you know, it's up to you guys really at the end of the day. What is acceptable for you? And as I said, We can help you achieve it, but it's up to you to... Whoops, I think I've finished. I have too. That's all I've got for you, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that was of some use in